Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Tony Flock with Creative Leadership Solutions, and I'm pleased to be your moderator today as we learn more about how educational equity means that every student has access to rigorous and relevant instruction and supports that will lead to ambitious outcomes. Today, you'll hear from Dr. Kate Anderson Foley and Dr. Douglas Reeves as they discuss the legal and ethical considerations for serving students with disabilities and effective practices that promote equity. We hope that this conversation will ignite innovation and help you prepare for the academic year. Just a few notes before we begin. All participants have been muted due to audience size, so you are in listen-only mode. Please use the question or chat feature in your GoToWebinar control panel to share any questions or comments with us. We will stop to respond to those as they come in, as there are natural transition points between slides. A copy of today's PowerPoint slides are available in the handout section of your control panel for you to download. So please grab those from there. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be posted to our website shortly. It typically takes about a day for that recording to process. So look for that recording after that. And we encourage you to share this with any friends or colleagues who are unable to attend. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce Dr. Douglas Reeves, founder of Creative Leadership Solutions. He's the author of more than 40 books and 100 articles on education, leadership, and student achievement. Doug and the Creative Leadership team are providing free webinars for teachers, leaders, parents, and students around the world. Doug.
Well, thanks so much, Tony, and good afternoon, everybody. We're really happy that you were able to join us, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kate Anderson Foley. You got the A-team today. If you're interested in MTSS, if you're interested in special education, literally with somebody from experience from the classroom to the district to state level, Dr. Anderson Foley is the answer. She brings a wealth of not only academic knowledge, but practical application. And I've heard her been able so wisely to address some of the concerns of how do you deal with special education needs in a virtual environment? How do we deal with the fact that in a virtual environment, our IEPs don't necessarily match up to what practice is? And most importantly, how do we extend the best professional care for our students? So with my great pleasure to introduce Kate, please take it away.
Thank you, Doug, for that kind introduction. So I think we're going to start with the learning protocols. Just stop us anytime if you have any questions or challenges, and that we really are encouraging you to represent the people who are not in the room. So the questions that you might have, the comments that you might have, the perspective taking that you might have, that's great. And use the question or the chat features within that. And if we cannot get to your question today, please know that we will follow up individually with you in a really short amount of time, because we value your time and we value the comments and the questions that you bring forward, okay? So we are going to take a look at the learning targets today. We're gonna move pretty fast today, but I need to step back in order to move forward. So we're gonna do that and very briefly talk through the Supreme Court case of Andrew F. So that's the Andrew standard, and then move into effective practices. And then finally, what's the call for innovation? I think we're here right now, and I think we're all up for the challenge. Go to the next slide, please.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, we want to start with a quick poll, and please know that your responses are anonymous, but we'd always like to get a feel for our audience. So if you would take your cell phone out, please, and send a text to recipient 22333, so address your text message to recipient 22333, and type the message Creative Lead 764 that you see on the screen. Once joined, you should receive a response indicating that you have joined. All right, give you about another 10 seconds to do that. And then we will post the question. So again, send a text to recipient 22333. The message that you should send is Creative Lead 764. And we would like to know, are you familiar with the Andrew F. decision and how it shifted the requirement for providing FAPE to students with disabilities? A for yes, B for no, and C for unsure. Excellent, Kate. Looks like responses are rolling in.
That's great. That's fast. Very useful. So it looks like more are no. So today is going to be perfect.
And give you about another 15 seconds, ladies and gentlemen, to send those responses in. All right. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you. So this is very good. And I want to just, again, you got to step back in order to move forward, understand where some of this came from. So I wanted to tell you the story of Andrew and Andrew F. Andrew F. was a young student who had autism and had more complex needs, both academically and behaviorally. And this young man was identified from preschool all the way up to 4th grade, with autism, and yet they were having the same type of IEPs over and over again. And it wasn't until the district presented the family with the IEP that looked the same, and that's what the parents were really talking about and had trouble with. So they withdrew the student, put the student into a private school, and then the district provided or offered another IEP. Yet again, it looked the same. And so the family, of course, did what is certainly within their prerogative, and that is to go through the legal process with the state up to the court. And it was the 10th Circuit Court that actually decided the case. And this is how they decided it. I'm going to pause that because it's real important in order to understand what that decision is, how we got there. So if you look at this chart, you'll see the first civil rights type of thing. And yes, there were some before, but these are the big salient landmark cases. Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 said, it's not the same, right? You can't have, 2 different education systems going on. It's not equal, it's not fair, it's not right. Then we moved into 75, so you can see all those years that happened. But in 75, that's the landmark act, and that's the Education of the Handicapped Children's Act, and that passed. And what that did was just physically open the door to public education as institutions were closing. Students and children with varying disabilities were now starting to matriculate into public schools. And there's a lot to go with that, and that's not what this webinar is about. But from 75 to the very beginning to 82. Now 82 was the Supreme Court decision Rowley, and the Rowley decision, which was the standard, which you probably have already for many, many years have been working under. People call it the Rowley standard, the Rowley set, that if you have any kind of some progress, you are meeting your obligation for a free and appropriate public education. Well, we can now know that the Andrew decision will change that. But before we get into Andrew, the Rowley said, reasonably calculated. I bet you've heard that before, right? The IEP is reasonably calculated. Well, not quite sure what that means, but that's what the courts decided. But in 1990, with the reauthorization, it started to now drill into reasonably calculated and that the IEP was aligned to standards. We know the Common Core, et cetera, started to really change some things. But it still left kids on IEPs sitting off to the side. Potential of growth. Where was the ambitious IEP? What kind of data were they using to determine that FAPE was provided? And it wasn't until Andrew F., now I'm going to go back to my story, that after the 10th Circuit said, you know what, Andrew, he is getting an IEP that meets FAPE because we're using the Rowley standard. Well, here's the Rowley standard. It's Latin de minimis, and that translates into just more than trivial. So I want you to think about that, and think about if you had a child, regardless of IEP or not, if you were satisfied with your child having just more than trivial educational benefit. You might have a problem with that. And that's in fact what the parents of Andrew F. did. They appealed, they went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided 8-0, so a unanimous decision that said, no, the standard is more demanding than merely more de minimis. So we can go to the next slide, please. And here's what it is. So now we've got these dimensions of special education and how it shifted. So again, Rowley really, opened that door and established some, that's in quotes, for educational benefit. But here Rowley's saying, Andrew's saying, no, you need a substantive obligation for a school district to say they have provided a free and appropriate public education, and that schools were held accountable for that substantive progress. You'll see substantive throughout this. That's real important, jot that down. It's not just the trivial anymore. It's so much more than that. And that IEPs really needed to be prospective. That means look to the future and make it fact-driven, but look to the future. You shouldn't be giving IEPs that look the same year after year or just making minimal progress. Design with the end in mind. A student on an IEP will graduate, will live life. So what will he or she need? Now, in the case of Andrew F., needed more academic supports and more behavioral supports, right? And so we'll get into a little bit of that as we're looking at effective practices. Here's some interesting pieces. So the IEP needs to be tailored to meet the unique needs of the student. And the Supreme Court said, it needs to be reasonably calculated so the child can make progress in light of the child's circumstances, and that every child should have a chance to meet challenging objectives. So regardless of where the child sat on the continuum of disability, think about Rowley. She was in general education classrooms, minimal, going grade to grade, and getting good grades, where Andrew needed more assistance, okay? But that substantive obligation was still there. And therefore, that robust type of prospective IEP needed to be in place, need to be ambitious. And then here's the other part of it. No one test to determine free and appropriate public education. And now I'm just going to use the word FAPE, or the acronym FAPE. So no one test can be providing FAPE. It's a higher standard. There's a wide continuum of children with disabilities. The IEP needs to be cogent, needs to be responsive, and that the adequacy then turns to the unique circumstances of the child for whom it was created. So if we can go to the next slide.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, and as we transition to another polling activity, if you have questions for Dr. Foley or Dr. Reeves, please feel free to send those in using the question or chat feature. If you joined the poll previously, just be ready to send your response in. If not, please send a text. If you have not joined the poll already, please send a text to recipient 22333 and type the message Creative Lead 764. Give you just about another 5 seconds to get that phone out and be ready. And the question that we'd love for you to respond to now is, have you seen evidence that your state Department of Education has communicated this new standard in Andrew to local school districts? A for fully, B for partially, C for no, and D, I'm not really sure. And Dr. Kate, responses rolling in quickly. We have a very responsive audience.
That's wonderful. I'm watching it go back and forth. Interesting. Oh, okay. Very interesting.
All right, and we'll give you just a few more seconds. And Dr. Kate, it looks like a couple of folks are having difficulty, but going to send responses in either through the chat. So as I get those extra responses that don't show up on the poll, I will share them with you.
Okay, so it looks like 30% yes fully, 24% yes partially, 25% no, and 22% unsure.
All
So
right. Thank you,
that's,
folks.
yeah, thank you. That's pretty informative. We can go to the next slide because, this Supreme Court decision was in 2017. So you'd think 2018-19 school year, 19-20 school year. So now we're solidly in with the Andrew standard. I think some of the clash now, or the challenge, could be now that we're in a virtual world for a large part, not only currently, but there might be some opportunity in the future that we're going to continue to be in a blended model or virtual model. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this. I want to just spend a little bit of time on, okay, so here are the considerations for that higher standard. And this is what the Supreme Court kept, drilling in. You have to address the child's potential for growth. We should not be looking at the child by disability per se, okay? And instead, we should be looking at a child's potential for growth expansively, right? And if the IEP, which it is the vehicle for providing a FAPE, it moves the argument into its rightful place, and that's equity. Okay, so what's fair? What does that child need? Again, not year after year having the same type of IEPs, but what are those proven practices, effective practices that will get the growth in which we're looking for, right? Special ed teachers and others, we want to do right by our kids, but what is that, right? So we want to make sure that we're implementing an IEP that's reasonably calculated to make that progress in light of that child's circumstance, which means make the an IEP robust as the individual level. It's not because the student has autism, okay, so the IEP is going to be all calculated around autism. No, it's that child with autism. And what does that child need in order to meet those academic standards, those challenging academic standards, right? Not just I'm a fourth grader and I'm going to have second grade standards. That's not it at all. Fourth grade, what are the fourth grade standards? But then how do we stretch? How do we pull that thread to get down in order to scaffold back up, okay? And then you want to use a variety of data to determine the amount of progress. And that's been a big thing now that we're in this virtual space. I would suggest later on that we need to look at how we're approaching IEPs, but also writing the IEPs. And I have an example about that as well. And that, you really do need to have some good data, but you need to have robust data systems in order to do that. I think teachers and paraprofessionals, related service providers can drive themselves crazy trying to capture data. We need to be very clear on what we're saying. This is the thing that's going to get the growth in which we're hoping for, okay? So if we can move to the next slide. All right, so let's start to shift into some of those effective practices. You'll hear me say, if anyone knows me, that students with disabilities are first and foremost, general education students. Now, that statement, that proclamation shifts how we think about special education, right? What are the powerful things that we do for all kids, including students with disabilities? And from that place, then you can start to tailor the learning, tailor the specially designed instruction, behavioral supports, etc. Okay, the functional skills. High expectations of adults for students is my #1 non-negotiable. I hope it's yours as well. We can't say that simply because a student has an intellectual disability or autism that we somehow lower our expectations. We can't. We just can't do that. It didn't work all those years, and it's not going to work now. You also need to really make sure that you're looking at implementing instruction and the intervention practices that have a high degree of effect. And I reference Hattie here. So I use a 0.40, the effect size. That is the marker. So whenever you're looking for those practices, that's what you're trying to do. And Doug, ourselves at Creative Leadership, Hattie and other researchers really drill into this, that it's not a program, it's the practice that's going to get children where they need to go, and that's their rightful place in this world. So think about that as you're looking at specially designed instruction. It needs to be delivered with precision. It can't be that you're just having a child go through the motions of a program. That's not specially designed instruction. What are the challenging academic standards? How do you put that into an IEP? How do you start to pull it apart in order to put it back together? Okay, but the focus is on potential, ambitiousness, and challenging standards. Okay, and that specially designed instruction is in fact the cornerstone of that. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide. So looking at the quality of the students' least restrictive environment, the LRE. This is an important piece, and this is what Andrews had also to do. Just sitting in a general education classroom is insufficient. It always was, but I think it's becoming more so apparent. A child sits in the classroom, and on the IEP, it says, you know, we'll spend 80% or more in the general education classroom with or without supports. But what I have found in my travels and in my experiences that oftentimes children who are sitting in the general education classroom are siloed, and they do not have access to the curriculum, let alone in a way that makes sense for them. So again, think about the quality of the students' educational experiences. Make sure it's into the IEP, okay? Also make sure that in-class supports are designated on the IEP and that they're implemented. So accommodations, modifications, the related service providers to help access the general curriculum, and that you're using a variety of data to make those decisions about substantive progress, not just, you know, skimming along here, but what are the real process piece. Okay, next slide. So I wanted to share this with you because I said, you know, Hattie and other researchers look for the, you know, 0.40. That's the magic marker, right? That says these are powerful influences. These are powerful practices. And I've got, you can see two different things here. One is in words with the effect size, and one is the little bit of a graphic that helps, okay? So take a look at these. I'm not sure if any surprise you. These are for all kids, including students on IEPs, right? Because we're talking about students with disabilities today. So talk about any other kind of student at risk, EL, students on 504 plans, all students. But for today, we're looking at students covered under the federal law of special education. So I'm going to highlight some important ones that I think will really help grow your students in positive ways. But I will say, before we move on to the next slide, by comparison, this is important, popular practice of ability grouping has an effect size of 0.10. Look where it is on the graphic. Not good. It's not effective. So while we oftentimes think LRE, get the students, you know, in small groups in the special education classroom, it's like an automatic mindset, right? We're going to write an IEP and this is where the student's going to go. Well, take a look at what that effect size is. Ability grouping really doesn't have the power that you were hoping that it was going to do. So we need to look at some other things. Okay, so let's go to the next slide.
Dr. Katie, as we transition, 2 comments have come in. Melissa very much agreed with your reference of practices, not programs. Her response was yes, with an exclamation point.
All right.
And Art sent a comment in regarding Hattie's work that we have to show how teachers become students of their own teaching so that students become teachers of their own learning, quoting Professor Hattie.
Absolutely. So you'll like this next slide then, right? So specially designed instruction is an example of some of that powerful teaching. So here we have an example of micro teaching. Think about that. So you have great teaching and it's powerful. Micro teaching is powerful and it's got a 0.88 effect size. Now drill into that specially designed instruction. That is the cornerstone of special education, right? And that's an example of micro teaching, and that the IEP goals then provide the basis for that ambitious instruction. It can be like a shot. It doesn't have to necessarily be 40 minutes long, but specially designed instruction could be you're teaching a novel skill and it's 15 minutes of direct instruction, but now you need to practice it. Now you can practice it in a small group that's nerd out about it, but you can also practice it within the classroom itself, right? Along with the peers. And so kind of getting to your point about now teachers need to have a different way of looking at things and become, you know, part of that learning process, but kids also need to be a part of that learning process, right? The other is discrete skills. Again, like I said, can be taught, but it should be taught in a culturally responsive way. It needs to be relevant, right? Kids need to be engaged. They need to see themselves in the learning. And so if it's not a part of that, then you're going to have disengaged students, which will incur some behavior, right? The other is that the meta skills, the meta muscle, if you will, can be built so kids can scaffold up to their potential. Now we're starting to get into not only the effective practices, but then also reaching to the legal side and the aspirational components of not only the IDEA, but the NDRU standard, okay? I hope you can see that this isn't a this or a that. I gotta take a piece of this, I gotta take a piece of that. No, we're creating a holistic system that's good for all kids, okay? And that teachers then use that data to assess progress toward goal attainment. That's FATE, right? The adequacy piece. And so if we can go to the next slide.
And a comment as we transition from Yocasta, micro teaching per skill to keep track of the flow of the needs of the class moving towards higher standards. Seems like that's resonating with her.
I like it. I'm so glad. I'm so glad. So yeah, I mean, this is it. But again, keep thinking as we're going through today, how can I start to change these IEPs? How will professional development need to start rolling in and rolling out and then rolling back up into the IEP and those services? That's kind of where we're talking about. Students can improve when they know what the target is, right? You're providing meaningful feedback. Teachers then start to use that information to course correct. That's the formative piece, right? Doesn't have to be, 20 questions long, but it needs to be one or two. I got to get to the information that I'm looking for. That reciprocal teaching then can happen. So you've got that direct instruction, you've got the modeling, you've got the practice, and then it shifts. Students start to take ownership of their own learning. That's what we want for all students, but that is really critical for students on IEPs. They need to see themselves, but they need to become aware of their learning. Because remember, even when you're in elementary school, you are starting to teach students the compensatory skills so they can be successful in middle school and high school, college, career, whatever it is. It's really, really important. So we need to start at a very young age, okay? And that, I would finally say, when we work then on the self-reported grades, then we can start to support the whole process as well. All right, next slide. Okay. So here's an example that I wanted to show you. I said like an example of a reading goal. All right. So we've talked about micro teaching. We've talked about, a lot of the things that we know are good practices. Well, here's one. Here's how an IEP should change. So the special education teacher's going to co-plan and co-serve. So it doesn't necessarily mean the co-teaching is the thing. There are varying degrees of effect with co-teaching. More importantly is the co-planning, because that's where you're going to dissect in order to start putting it together. pay attention to the individual circumstances of the child that created that IEP in the first place, and then start to scaffold up, not only to the potential, but to the challenging objectives and standards, okay? So co-plan, co-serve, 5th grade language arts teacher. And then the teacher is going to provide direct instruction, 70 minutes per week, in the areas of decoding and comprehension. Well, I chose decoding and comprehension because that was my example for that's the specially designed instruction. That's that gap that the student has. Decoding is really hard for this 5th grade student. And then that impedes comprehension. So now you've got the support for the whole teacher and the student, and now you're drilling into that micro teaching. And here's how it would look on to an IEP. 70 minutes of direct instruction, 150 minutes co-planning and reading, 100 minutes per week consulting other content areas. So for sure, science and social studies, could be art, could be music, could be PE, that's up for the discretion of the IEP team. And then to support this reading goal or English language arts goal, 45 minutes of consultation by the speech language pathologist. Why? Because that's the expertise, right? How do you help with decoding? Here's some strategies for building comprehensive skills. And by the way, I'm also practicing these with the student in my speech therapy sessions on a weekly basis. So we should be looking at the same information and providing the same types of support. Does that make sense? I hope so. All right, let's go to the next slide.
So a couple of questions, Dr. Kate, as we transition. From Melissa, what do you suggest as caseloads so that related services or in-class supports are available?
Well, caseloads sometimes are driven by collective bargaining agreements or by the state's ratios. So I want to make sure I'm real clear on what we're talking about. Are we talking about like for speech language pathologists, can they have 100 students on their caseload period, regardless of age, regardless of LRE setting? Or is it something different? I think I'd need more information. But if they write that down and submit it, I'm happy to follow up.
So Melissa, if you wouldn't mind perhaps emailing us, and you'll see Dr. Kate's email address at the end. Next question that came in from Lisa: How do we do self-reported grading with our youngest students? And I think you're actually going to address that towards the end, aren't you?
I am going to. So if we can just hold that thought, that'd be great.
All right, and then 2 comments here. Thank you as an instructional coach. This is music to my ears. And Felicia commented that co-planning, she loves it because she finds it very beneficial for all students.
Exactly, because you can also then capture the MTSS kind of, like, okay, here's our at-risk kids. There's a lot of great, powerful benefits for that. So love that. Love to hear this feedback. Okay, so I talked about Andrew. He was a more complex kid. He had academic needs, but he also had behavioral needs. So now we're starting to look at again. So I'm using the court case as my my story, but really this is how you put it into place, real life, right? So there's always a nexus between disability, least restrictive environment, and the FAPE, right? Classroom behavior, but it's also the behavioral classroom itself, okay? So I want to make sure we're talking about a nested concept. Classroom behavior is, direct, but the behavior of the classroom includes your culture, your climate, your routines, and your expectations. But always remember this, that all behavior has a purpose, okay? It all does. Positive, negative, and the negative, for all you behavioralists out there, negative reinforcement, the negative behavior is more powerful oftentimes, right? That a student will do a negative behavior because I'm getting the attention that I'm seeking, regardless of how it is, okay? And again, we could do a whole nother webinar on behavior and extinguishing or shaping behavior. But here's some examples of how the nested pieces of the classroom behavior and the student kind of permeates the overall classroom behavioral pieces of the classroom. On-task and off-task behaviors can impede access to rigorous and relevant content, right? It's often seen as justification for a more restrictive environment, a more restrictive setting. You know, hey, Andrew can't do this and he's having tantrums or he's throwing so-and-so, get him out of the classroom. You've got to get to the root of that and then get to the root again. So the root of the root, what is causing that behavior, and then drill into that piece of it in order to provide the not only the discrete, specially designed instruction for that, but then the supports to go along with that. Why? Because then they can access their learning. It's kind of like food, right? If your belly's hungry, you're not going to attend. Well, if your behavior's not right, you're not regulated, you're not going to be able to access learning. So think about that. I get this a lot, and I've seen this a lot. Kids are compliant or they're quiet. They might be perceived as withdrawn, but they've got behaviors that if I sit here and don't draw attention to myself, then I'm good. I'm going to get skipped over and all is good. Well, as we can see on the slide, it really does mask engagement, the persistence skills that kids are going to need in order to tackle this hard stuff, you know, and the potential of a student. Kind of goes back to the Andrew standard, right? Got to have high expectations for kids. That behavioral effect was 0.80, so that's pretty high. But when we get these conditions right, then students can learn. Okay, next slide.
All right, and
So
as we transition again, sorry, but a question, how does all of this fit with the current pandemic virtual instruction from Georgina?
can we hold that, because it really
Sure.
does, yeah, it really does fit all together. That regardless of the platform, regardless of the environment, these things have to be in place in order for rigorous and relevant learning to take place. Okay, so collaboration, shared accountability. Here's a clear example. Students, accessing Google Classroom. You got to have the collaboration between the general education classroom, special ed teacher, related service provider, the student, the family. It's got to be there. You got to have shared accountability. Are we all in this, or are we looking at this as a siloed system? I'll provide the language arts, and special ed teacher, you provide, whatever it is that you need to provide, and never the two come together in a classroom or the virtual classroom, right? Again, you need to make learning interesting, relevant, engaging. Again, whether you're sitting in a classroom, sitting on your classroom virtually, you got to make it interesting. Students with disabilities are already marginalized in a virtual setting, oftentimes for a variety of reasons, including access to internet and access to the platform. Students are not, they're not tuning in at all. They're not engaging. So more and more of their education is being off to the wayside. And sometimes that's not going to be coming back. Okay. Here's an effective practice. You need to teach and practice persistence. Again, not only to get to the content itself, but in the way it's going to be delivered. So again, to our questionnaire, it is, if it's on a virtual product or a blended hybrid type of situation, kids have to be taught persistence. Okay, this is hard. How do you chunk something? How do you go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 to step 4 to completion? Okay. Supportive classroom. Again, brick and mortar, however it's going to come out. There has to be common rules and routines. While they benefit every student, for some students, it's going to be very important. These are the things that I follow. These are the things that are going to help me be able to access my learning and demonstrate what I know. And then, again, it goes back to that larger piece, that behavioral side. You have to have that accountability and the advocacy. And for some of our students, it needs to be discrete teaching of how do you advocate for yourself. That is a social skill. That is a functional skill, adaptive skill that oftentimes we need to teach our children. I would say we need to teach all children, but we explicitly teach children on IEPs, and sometimes that's written into it. And then utilizing that small group learning, which is a good model to teach those things. Okay, next slide. All right, we're going to get to our next polling activity.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, and to some of your questions that have come in, we are going to be transitioning into some ideas for self-reported grading. So again, if you have joined the poll, just get that cell phone out and have it handy. If you have not joined the poll yet, then please send a text to recipient 22333. Type the message Creative Lead 764. Give you just a moment to do that. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this is a word cloud, so please use one word to respond. You may respond as often as you'd like, but we'd like to know what you believe happens when we engage students in setting goals for their learning. Again, please use one word. You may send in as many responses as you'd like. Looks like they're already rolling in, Dr. Kate.
Oh, I like it. Look at this. Yes. Agency, look at that. Yeah, that's really good.
Couple of themes emerging: ownership, empowerment, success.
Yep. Yes.
All right,
Ownership
keep those responses.
is big. Yeah, look at that.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We'll give you about another 20 seconds to get those responses in. Well, I certainly think this bodes well for the upcoming slides, Dr. Kate.
I think so. I love the ownership. Look at that. Success, integrity, improvement, authenticity, empowerment. This is good stuff. Thank you so much for sharing these.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. All right.
All right. So let's move on to the self-reported grades. Our questioner, one of our questioners asked us, this is huge. It has an effect size of 1.44. Think about that. And you've got the slides to go back to it. This is powerful, right? One of the words in the word cloud said agency. Yeah, this is it. So the estimates of their own performance, though, a lot of it has to do with how they have been treated in the past or how they perceive themselves, right? Do they have any ownership of their IEP goals? A lot of kids don't know what's on their IEPs. Now, when you're at middle school and high school, hopefully those are part of it and you've sat into those IEP meetings. But I think we should have high expectations and start to get to our younger kids as well. It's definitely shaped by their previous learning experiences. Are they off to the side or are they robustly with their peers? And that's really good. And you tailor the learning to that. Shaped by their perceptions of themselves. This is big lift sometimes. And sometimes our related services like a social worker or, psychologists, special ed teachers, we all need to rally around students like that. But it also has to do with how others perceive them. And that's really powerful as well. Again, it kind of goes back to LRE. If they're in the classroom, but nothing's really happening, that's how others are perceiving them, that they're not good enough. So these are just some things to think about as we move into some of these, putting them into practice. So our next slide. When I was a teacher many moons ago, I would always involve my, I had upper elementary to, going into middle school, always had them, what's going on? What do you think you need to work on? What are your short-term goals? What are your targets? And then put that into the IEP, not willy-nilly, but I knew what they needed to work on and I needed their input and buy-in, if you will, even though I kind of hate that word. Their commitment to it, really important to make that happen. And then you develop that system so students can start self-assessing their own progress. Put a rubric. Kids understand rubrics. Checklists, journal, interview. If you have weekly student conferences with them, again, doesn't matter if you're brick or mortar, but I do think it's very, very important as we're in this kind of funky place on the virtual world. We need to know what's going on with the kids. Kids need to be aware of their learning, that metacognitive metacognition of understanding how they're learning or what's the barrier to their learning, and we need to come around and solving that. I think very important and powerful is incorporating that reflection into the daily routine. Again, that's not brick and mortar, that's just good practice. And then emphasize progress, not ability. Remember, ability grouping really had kind of a negative effect, where if you emphasize progress and you emphasize the persistence within that, the effort within that progress, that's going to start building the muscle that the kids need in order to get to that next scaffolded skill to reach their potential. And then, of course, you communicate those learning intentions to students, the targets. Every student should know what it is that they are aiming toward. So if we go to the next slide, I've got some examples of how you can start to work with kids in the primary grades. So here's some samples or prompts, right? This isn't, what'd you learn today, right? What was easy? What wasn't easy? What don't you understand? What could you get better at? Even if it's one thing that they could get better at. I need help with what? Tell me. And then I can start to put that in. It's good formative piece, it's good feedback. It helps students understand who they are as the learner. And it's, disability doesn't equal destiny. They have the opportunity, and you with them, to change that course for them, okay? Next slide. So here's an example of how you would, and this was to an earlier person's question, there's some different ways. Some are just really simple. You probably have a cache of these types of things in your repertoire. These are just really easy way. You think about Andrew, he had academic and behavioral complexities, could be taped onto his desk, could be taped onto the virtual desk, if you will, could be posted on the refrigerator, wherever it needs to be, but that's the daily reflection. All right, let's go on to middle and high school. Here's some sample questions and prompts. Obviously, it's more sophisticated in language, but sophisticated in concept, right? Are you satisfied in what you showed, your knowledge and your skill? How does it compare to the expectations of the rubric? There's a deep question though, right? It's easy, but it helps the student understand his or her learning. And then you as the educator can start to not only drill into it, but in order then to scaffold up. You'll hear me say that over and over again. You're scaffolding up to a student's potential. And you're doing it in a real way. And you're doing it in a powerful way that's gonna tip that scale over, right? Identifying what worked, what didn't work, what strategies do you need? If there are specific strategies, as I mentioned, as you get older, you're looking for those compensatory skills on the kind of learner that I am. For example, I'm very auditory. So oftentimes I might look in the classroom that I'm not paying attention. I'm kind of eliminating the visual so I can get to my audio, okay? That's the kind of thing that is helpful. You can then take that into the science or social studies class and say, hey, Kate's not being a goof off, she's attending. See what I mean? So that's where everyone's accountable and everyone's working on the work, okay? So if we can go to the next slide. And then here's some visuals of how that would work. It's not a lot, right? Here's a simple paragraph rubric or a self-assessment type of rubric. But that self-grading is the most significant influence on student achievement. When you can get that from a student, you can really start to make that change. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide. So I call this my call for innovation. While maybe you didn't hear all the magic that you thought you were going to hear, you already have some of the magic in you. And so this is a call for innovation in a different way. You need to think about how the trajectory of a child's life can change when potential is considered expansively rather than ability. Just because a student has a learning disability or autism or a speech language disorder, that doesn't define the person. But in fact, when you can look at that child's potential in an expansive way, then you are going to be more ambitious in your planning and your delivery of that instruction. Also think about the innovation of the substantive piece. right? Think about how a substantive obligation providing FAPE can be met when everyone is accountable for the teaching and the learning and the achievement. So it's not just incumbent upon the special education teacher, it's every ed, and it's the students, and it's the parents, and all the related services around that, okay? Think about that professional collaboration. You're doing some things virtually. I am betting that you can drill in a little bit more, and then you can start to create IEPs that have co-planning and co-serving within. It's written. You've now worked with districts, your leadership, and you're providing that professional development. And it might take a little bit of time, but I say now is the time that you should be learning about what worked during this phase of virtual or blended learning. What lessons, what positives can you start to take? Bake it into the plan moving forward. There are things that we would want to do that we don't ever want to go back to. Here's an example of how do you start to put the IEP into play using the Andrews standard, that higher, more substantive standard, in order to get to the equity that you're looking for, okay? And then again, think about how disability doesn't need to define destiny. Might be a simple question, but I can't tell you how hard that is sometimes for people to come around and consider those things, right? So innovation is about looking at things from a different perspective, figuring out new ways of thinking and doing and learning. So regardless of the platform, we should be look toward the efficacy of high quality instruction and interventions to narrow and or eliminate the gaps, or in today's terms, flatten the curve, right? We're looking to flatten the curve for the virus. Well, we should be looking to flatten that gap, compress that gap. So let's go to the next slide. So there has been a lot of talk about flattening the curve, and in the context of special education, children at risk, who are talking about changing the actual trajectory of a child's life. So take that coronavirus when we think about flattening the curve, and now think about what this webinar was all about. This is that equivalent. That is changing the trajectory of a child's life. This parallel system that has existed for 45 years, since 1975, doesn't serve our students. It just opened the door to public education. But by rejecting the notion that just more than trivial, that de minimis standard, education is good enough for our most vulnerable learner, if you can reject that, then we raise the floor of education for each and every child, because we know they're worth it. And I just want to end by reading this from the Supreme Court Justice. When all is said and done, a student offered an education program providing merely more than de minimis progress from year to year can hardly be said to have offered an education at all. For children with disabilities, receiving instruction that aims so low that it would be tantamount to sitting idly waiting for time when they were old enough to drop out. The IDEA demands more. And I think this slide really brings that to the forefront. Turn it over to my colleague, Doug.
Well, Kate, I just want to thank you so much for your insight and wisdom. And to our participants this afternoon, I want to commend the fact that this is the beginning of our conversation, not the end. Dr. Anderson Foley has done these webinars all over the United States and is willing to do so for your district, your region, your state. So whether it's a large group or a smaller group, whether it's a region and state or your district, please let us know and we'll be happy to accommodate you. You see our contact information at the bottom of your screen there. There's also lots of resources, videos, and articles and tools that you can use and download at creativeleadership.net. So thanks very much for your kind attention. Kate, thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Several of you asked for links to existing webinars and have already sent me emails. I will follow up with those this evening, and we look forward to continuing that conversation. Have a great rest of the week.